The presidential campaign of Vivek Ramaswamy is picking up steam as the biotech entrepreneur goes from political unknown to a candidate more voters in New Hampshire and across the country are beginning to seriously consider as a primary contender. Mr. Ramaswamy is our guest this morning. Vivek, thanks for being here.
It's good to see you.
Yeah. So your campaign was recently circulating a memo that had looked at some internal polling, and it said you are on track to eclipse Ron DeSantis, who's been in second place this whole time. For voters who are considering both of you, what's the difference between you and DeSantis?
So I'm the candidate in this race who's leading us to something. I think we as conservatives have been running from something for a long time. Wokeism, transgenderism, climatism. I wrote the book on this several years ago, Woke Inc. But I don't think it's enough for us to just criticize the cultural poison on the left. I think we have to have an affirmative vision of our own. Answer what it means to be an American. Use that to dilute the woke agenda to irrelevance. That's how we win. And I think that's also how we deliver a landslide election in 2024. I think we have the opportunity to do it. As Ronald Reagan did it in 1980, I think we can win in a landslide in 2024 if we bring young people along with us, with an actual vision grounded in individual, family, nation, God. That beats race, gender, sexuality, and climate. But we have to have the courage to actually stand for something, not just to be against what the left puts up on offer. And I think that's what I'm doing uniquely in this race.
As you've been on the rise, you've been a fairly zealous defender of the frontrunner, President or former President Donald Trump. He even kind of paid you a bit of a backhanded compliment when he was here in June saying, well, Vivek's on the way up, but he just says nice things about me, and that's why. So at some point, it might be a little absurd if you are in second place and you have to challenge former President Trump, but you've been so kind to him. So what's going to happen when you're there and you have to draw that contrast?
Well, here's the reality is I'm not running against anyone in this race. I am running for this country. So there are people who are upset that I'm not criticizing Trump. Here's why I'm not. His election in 2016, I think, was the single most important political milestone of the 21st century. That's what stopped what I view as a sort of Marxist march in our country that would have continued from Obama into Hillary Clinton. He put an end to that, and I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful for his Supreme Court justices and exposing corruption in the government. But now we have to take that agenda further. And the reality is about 30% of this country becomes psychiatrically ill when he is in the White House. That's not his fault, but it's just a fact. I'm not having that same effect on people. I'm grounded in principles, in moral foundations. And I think we take our America First agenda even further when we do it on moral foundations. I'm also 37. I have fresh legs. I'm not jaded and cynical and tired. I'm ready for the long haul. And for me, November 2024, it is not the finish line. That is the start line. The finish line is when I leave office in January 2033. What do I want to tell the people of this country that we did? The administrative state, the deep state, we shut it down, restoring our constitutional republic. We're no longer dependent on our enemy, China, for our modern way of life. That's what we'll say. Our economy is growing at over 4+% GDP growth again. And everyone in this country, especially young people, will once again be proud to be citizens of this country. And more so than anybody else in this race, I think I am best positioned to deliver all of those things, especially that revival of uniting national pride. And that's why I think we'll win in a landslide.
You've been very critical of this latest indictment of former President Trump over January 6th. You believe this is born out of political corruption and not facts.
I think this is politically motivated, no doubt. I think there are no coincidences in the fact that they're bringing 3 indictments against him at the same time in the midst of an election. But I'm not even in this to defend Trump. I'm in this to defend the country. I think this will set an awful precedent in our country. No doubt about it, Adam. If one party can do it today, the same shoe will fit the other foot tomorrow. And I don't want to see that happen in this country. I don't want to see us become some banana republic where whichever party is in control uses police power to arrest its political rivals. I'm going to be in the White House, I expect, as our next president to unite this country. But every indictment against Trump makes my future job as the next president that much more difficult. That's why I'm standing on the side of saying, look, I am polling at 3rd in the Republican national polls right now. It would be easier for me if Trump were eliminated from competition, but that is not how I want to win. I want to do it by convincing the voters, the people of this country, that I'm the best candidate to lead us forward. That's how we do things in the United States of America. And so for me, this is about principle, not politics. And I will always stand on the side of principle.
No matter how we got here, if an impartial jury finds Donald Trump guilty of what he's charged with related to January 6th, do you think the jury is corrupt?
I'm not going to call the judicial system corrupt. I think the judicial system is the last bastion of trust in our government today. However, I have said that I will pardon Trump for the 3 indictments, at least that have come so far that I've read, because I want to move our country forward. This is about running to something, reviving our national prosperity, our identity as Americans, and we're not going to do it by levying police power against our political rivals. We're going to do it by discovering the shared ideals that bind us together as Americans. That is why I'm in this race, and I'm confident that especially as the young person in this race, as an outsider in this race, as somebody who has lived the full arc of the American dream, my parents coming to this country as immigrants, me going on to found multi-billion-dollar companies, doing it while getting married, raising 2 sons. Yes, that is the American dream. I am worried we're losing it, but I don't think we've lost it yet. And that's what gives me my sense of urgency to say, yes, we're going to move this country forward and leave the vengeance and grievance behind us. And I think I'm the candidate to do it.
You were just in Tennessee calling for the release of the manifesto of the Nashville Covenant mass shooter. What do you think the public would gain from being able to read that document?
Well, Adam, we have a tradition in this country of within 48 hours of one of these tragedies, whenever it's recovered, we always release the manifesto. The same reason we recover a black box from an airplane crash. We don't want to see the same tragedy again. We live in a moment where the government is hiding the truth from the people. That does not build trust. That particular manifesto was the only one they've made an exception for because it was a transgender shooter, not to actually release it. That does not build public trust. That erodes public trust. My view is we, the people, we can handle the truth. The reason the people don't trust the government today is that the government doesn't trust the people. Trust is a two-way relationship, Adam. It takes both sides willing to actually engage in that trust. Whether it was the truth about the origin of COVID-19, the truth about government tech censorship, the truth about that Nashville shooter manifesto. What I've said is, as the U.S. president, even for the hard truths, even for the ugly truths, the ones that are bitter and hard to swallow, I will speak the truth. We will be transparent. That is how we actually rebuild trust. And even those with the best of intentions who say that we need to tell a noble lie, there's no such thing as a noble lie when it comes from government. All lies from the government are ignoble. And I think what we need is government leaders who once again embrace the truth. That's how we'll rebuild trust with the public.
And you point out the fact that the shooter is or was trans. You pointed out before that gender dysphoria is listed on the DSM as a mental disorder. Does that mean to you think trans people are mentally ill?
Certainly when a kid shows up and says that their gender does not match their biological sex, that means they're struggling. That means they're going through some difficulty. And Adam, I reject the idea that the compassionate thing to do is to somehow affirm that kid's confusion. That is not compassion. That is cruelty. And I believe that we will look back 50 years from now and say, how barbaric were we allowing 11, 12, 13-year-old kids to undergo genital mutilation and chemical castration because they're going through a difficult time in their lives, that those kids then later go on to regret. During one of my prior trips right here to New Hampshire, actually, I'm not far from where we're talking right now, I met 2 young women, Chloe and Katie. They're both young women. They regret their decision as teenagers to go through double mastectomies. In one of their cases, a hysterectomy. They will never be the same again. And I think that that is a deep regret that we as a society, as adults, allowed those kids to make those decisions that they now regret. And so for me, this comes not from a place of vengeance or retribution. It comes from a place of compassion, that we should be able to ask those kids and get to the bottom of what's going wrong at home, what's going wrong at school without being labeled transphobic. I don't think that's advancing the future for anybody, and I believe in standing on the side of truth.
You're on your way to where you want to go, but you're not there yet. So as you've made it to this point, what's the one thing you feel like you've gotten really right, and then something you had to correct or a mistake that you've made that you've, gotten past?
I think the thing that we've done well and I want to stick to is be unconstrained in speaking the truth. Now that I'm in third place, so I get a lot more media attention. Now there's people who want to, I didn't court large donors, but now there's large donors coming to us. And my view is it's going to all be required to lift us up. But I think the key for me is going to be to make sure that I stick to the approach of being unrestrained in speaking the truth. I'm not a super PAC puppet, and I want to keep it that way. I'm a patriot who speaks the truth. I don't stand on the side of incremental reform. I stand on the side of the American Revolution, those 1776 ideals. And I think one of the risks that now that I'm entering the upper echelon of this and attracting donor attention, one of the risks that I remind myself of every day is stay true to your purpose. Don't compromise your values or your principles for the short run. And so I think that's probably the thing that I remind myself the most, that we have been doing well, but that I need to be cautious to make sure that we continue doing well also. To tell you the truth, you could say, some people are saying that now I should maybe be more cautious in talking to the left. No. Actually, I believe in talking to everybody. I'm not running to lead a political party. I am running to lead a nation. And that means whether it's going to the south side of Chicago or Kensington in the middle of the inner city of Philadelphia, places where traditional Republican candidates don't go, there'll be a temptation to say we don't want to go to those places anymore. No, I think we're actually going to double down on it. Go to college campuses. Go on left-wing media that disagrees with me. My view is if I'm unwilling to sit across the table from NBC News or a left-wing media outlet, as many others in this race in the GOP primary have said they won't do, that means you're not really ready to sit across the table from Xi Jinping either. And so I will keep our talk to everyone strategy. Does that mean that occasionally, if I'm being very honest and unfiltered, that I'll say some things that, might upset some people from time to time? Sure, it does. But that's good for our country because we're founded on open dialogue. And so I'm actually going to stick to that approach.
All right, Vivek Ramaswamy, thanks for joining us here on Close Up. We'll see you out there on the trail.
Appreciate it. It's good to be back in New Hampshire.